Mr Speaker.
Stuart Nash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I stand in support of this bill, as does everyone on the Labor team. As has been noted, this was a process started by Leanne Dalzell. It was a process well implemented, taken over by Rodney Hyde. I think the least he could have done, or the Nats could have done, is give credit where credit's due, as we always do ourselves, Mr Speaker. This changes 13 acts and makes doing business a little bit easier. It's one of those standard processes that goes on. There's a lot of legislation that goes through the House every year, and as the nature of things change, so does the legislation. It becomes slightly outdated. There's no point in a lot of the time in repealing acts and rewriting them, so this is the sort of bill that comes in. But I would like to pick up on a couple of points made by a couple of the national speakers, if I may, Mr Speaker. Aaron Gilmore, he stood up here. Aaron Gilmore's a man who knows a lot about business. He stood up here and said this is part of a package of government economic reforms. Well, Mr Speaker, what I'm going to talk about Adam's stuff. I want to ask Mr Gilmore, where is National's plan around economic reform? And also I want to ask, is this national government really a government that is working for all New Zealanders? Now, Mr Gilmore stood up here and he said this is about National's economic reforms and how important this was. And then he stood up and he talked about the owner of a local video store. Now, no disrespect to the owner of Mr Gilmore's local video store, but I would have thought that the businesses of New Zealand that are struggling at the moment, and there are many businesses struggling, Mr Speaker, you just have to walk down the main street of Napier to see how many retailers are struggling, let alone manufacturers, etc. But, to put things into perspective, I think that the government and the country are facing much bigger, much graver and much more serious issues than Mr Gilmore's video store. And then what he did is he went on to talk about Mr Foss's iPod. Now, it is good that the chair of the Finance and Expenditure, iPad. It is good that the chair of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee has embraced technology and has an iPad. But really, come on, Mr Gilmore, I ask, is this really part of the economic growth? Is this part of the economic reform that all New Zealanders are actually looking to the government to deliver upon? There's been 2 years now. The first year, the first 12 months, a government can get away with saying, look, we're just getting our policies in place, we need to develop the right sort of criteria, we need to inform and we need to consult. They can get away with that for 12 months. But, Mr Speaker, it has now been 2 years and we have not seen a plan. New Zealanders have not seen a plan. Now, I'll tell you a story, and this is without a word of a lie, Mr Speaker. I had a chap come into my office yesterday and he said to me, I'm a sort of a swinging voter. A lot of swing voters out there, and he's involved in business. What he is he's a marine engineer. And what he does, he lives in Napier, but he travels over to Perth to work. And he earns very good money, but he said that the Australian companies love him because he pays Australian tax, he brings his money back here, and he spends his money here, and he's not because he's on contract. And what he said is, I've been listening for 2 years, and he said, I have not seen National articulate a plan. And I'll tell you what, I sat there with a huge smile on my face, and I said, you cannot believe it. I have heard that so many times. And we sit in this House, Mr Speaker, we sit in this House as Labour MPs. There are people that watch the House on television, they comb the newspapers and they look for policy statements, and they're saying, Mr Key, where is the plan for getting this country out of economic sort of doldrums and driving growth forward? Unfortunately, Mr Key leaves it to Mr Power, and Mr Power comes up and says, we're going to sell state assets. I think they're calling it the mixed ownership model, which is a nice bit of spin. It's a good bit of messaging, but it can't hide the fact that the only plan for economic growth that this government has put forward in 2011, Mr Speaker, is to sell New Zealand's public assets, to sell power companies. And then they stand up and they say, power prices to New Zealanders won't increase. Well, come on, stop being disingenuous. We know that under the free market model, power prices will increase. We were told by the Bradford reforms were going to break up the power sector, were going to make it a lot more competitive, and the power prices for New Zealanders were going to drop. It didn't happen. We're a country of 4.5 million people with a huge, wide, long country where the cost of infrastructure is so high. It didn't happen. It didn't happen. And I know why Dr. Mapp has decided to leave the National Party, because he must be getting a hell of a lot of jip from his mates around the barbecue over summer who says, what are you still doing there? He's off. That member's off to pursue other options, and I don't blame him. I don't blame him. He's got a doctorate in law. He knows what is going on. He doesn't. That member over there, Mr. Speaker, he doesn't want to sit in the back benches, because that's where he'll be, and say, "Oh goodness me, I've got better things to do with my time than go out to constituents and sell the policy of asset sales." But I am wrong. There was one other policy. And that was to mine national parks. To mine national parks. That was the policy of 2010. Let's forget about the tax cuts that gave $1,000 if you're earning over $1 million. Mine national parks. That was the economic development argument. And what happened? There were no flyers, there were no posters, no radios. Just through the power of the internet, they got about, 40,000 people? Whatever it was, Queen Street was filled from top to bottom with New Zealanders saying, you cannot mine national parks. This is not a plan. This is not a plan for economic growth and economic development. Now, I suspect what's going to happen this year is that New Zealanders are going to line from the top of Queen Street to the bottom and say, you cannot sell our state assets. Call it mixed ownership model, whatever you will. It is selling public assets. And that is not a plan. And that is not a government that is working for all New Zealanders. It just simply isn't. You know, I look at what's happening in the Napier electorate, and I am getting more and more people through my electorate office who normally wouldn't go near an MP's office because they have no need to canvass an MP, because at the moment that their wits end, they cannot see the plan for economic growth. There are 7,000 people who are unemployed along the east coast of the North Island, Mr. Speaker. 7,000 people. There are 158,000 New Zealanders who are unemployed. And you know what they're saying? You know what they're asking? Where is the plan, Mr. Key? Selling state assets is not a plan. Amy Adams stood up and she said, this is a government that is going to create jobs and drive economic growth. Well, we all want to create jobs. Everyone wants economic growth, but there is no plan. There is no plan for creating jobs and driving economic growth. I asked Ms Adams, please, next time you stand up, tell us what the plan is for doing this. I mean, Wairoa, for example, Wairoa's the top of the Napier electorate. I was talking to a local principal. They are 60 students down this year, 60 students down, because people are leaving the region. This is the provinces. This is heartland New Zealand. And there's no plan in heartland New Zealand. And you know what they did? They took $71 million out of infrastructure in Hawke's Bay and took it up to Auckland. On Sunday, I went and had a look at a Matahora Gorge open day. Now, the Matahora Gorge is an example of driving economic growth, because what it was is investing in infrastructure. The government should be doing this up and down the length of New Zealand. It's classic Keynesian economic theory, the sort of economic theory that most governments around the world are following at the moment. You invest in infrastructure. You don't spend $14 billion on tax cuts and then wait for economic growth. We had the finance minister come into the FEC committee and say, this will not promote economic growth, it will not stimulate the economy because it's not supposed to. Well, my question to the finance minister is, where is the plan? If you're going to spend $14 billion, then at least what the government can do is ensure that some of that money will go towards creating economic growth, will go towards growing jobs, growing this economy, and driving our economy towards export-led recovery. It is not happening. Mr Power is a very intelligent guy. I've got a lot of respect for Simon Power. He's a hard-working minister. That is why he was voted the top minister on that side. Mr Power must sit there sometimes and wring his hands and think, goodness me, there is more to this. Mr Power is the only one who's come up with a plan so far, but unfortunately it's to sell state assets. I do support this bill, Mr Speaker, because it is important in the regulatory framework, but, Mr Speaker, really, there needs to be an economic plan of growth going forward. Thank you very much.